1. The silent nightmare next door. When I first moved into my quaint little house on Maple Street, I thought I had found the perfect neighborhood. The streets were lined with towering oak trees, and the houses had a charming, almost storybook quality. It was the kind of place where you could imagine children playing in the yards and neighbors waving to each other as they mowed their lawns. But as I would soon discover, not all was as idyllic as it seemed. The house next door was a bit older, with a faded paint job and a slightly overgrown yard, but nothing too alarming. My new neighbor, Mr. Gibbons, was a quiet, middle-aged man who lived alone. He rarely left the house, and when he did, it was always in the dead of night. At first, I chalked it up to him being a night owl or perhaps working an unusual job that required odd hours. But as the weeks went by, things began to get strange. It started with the noises. At first, they were barely noticeable, a faint rustling sound here, a distant thud there. But as time passed, the noises grew louder and more frequent. I would hear what sounded like heavy objects being dragged across the floor, followed by a series of loud bangs. The strange thing was, these noises always occurred late at night, between 2 and 4 a.m. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that Mr. Gibbons was just a bit eccentric. After all, everyone has their quirks, right? But then the smell started. It was a foul, rancid odor that seemed to seep through the walls, filling my house with a sickening stench. No matter how many air fresheners I used or how often I opened the windows, the smell persisted. One night, the smell was so overpowering that I couldn't sleep. I decided to take matters into my own hands and investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I crept out of my house and into the backyard, where the smell was strongest. As I approached the fence that separated our yards, I noticed something strange. There were mounds of dirt scattered across Mr. Gibbons' yard, as if he had been digging. The smell was almost unbearable now, and I had to cover my nose with my shirt to keep from gagging. Curiosity got the better of me, and I climbed over the fence to get a closer look. As I approached one of the mounds, I noticed something sticking out of the dirt, something that looked disturbingly like a bone. My heart raced as I realized what I was looking at. I quickly scrambled back over the fence and ran back into my house, locking the doors behind me. The next morning, I called the police. I told them about the strange noises, the foul smell, and the bones in Mr. Gibbons' yard. They arrived within the hour and began searching the property. What they found was beyond anything I could have imagined. Mr. Gibbons had been living a double life. By day, he was the quiet, reclusive neighbor who kept to himself. But by night, he was a sadistic killer who had been burying his victims in his backyard. The police found multiple bodies buried in various stages of decomposition. It turned out that the noises I had been hearing were the sounds of him dragging his victims across the floor and burying them in the dead of night. Mr. Gibbons was arrested and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The house next door was torn down, and the lot was left vacant for years. But even after he was gone, I could never shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the neighborhood. The memory of what happened next door was a silent nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. 2. The noisy neighbor from hell. When I moved into my apartment in downtown Chicago, I was thrilled. The building was modern, the rent was reasonable, and I was just a short walk from work. It seemed like the perfect setup for a young professional starting out in the city. But my excitement quickly turned into a nightmare when I met my neighbor, Karen. Karen lived directly above me, and from the moment I moved in, it was clear that she had no concept of personal space or consideration for others. The noise started almost immediately. At first, it was just loud music, annoying, but nothing too out of the ordinary for city living. But then it escalated. Karen would blast her stereo at all hours of the night, often well past midnight, with the bass so loud that it rattled my windows. I tried knocking on her door to politely ask her to keep it down, but she never answered. Instead, the music would get even louder, almost as if she was daring me to complain. I thought about calling the building management, but I didn't want to seem like a complainer. I figured I could deal with it. After all, I had just moved in, and I didn't want to make waves. But things only got worse. Karen's parties became a regular occurrence. Every weekend, without fail, she would invite dozens of people over, turning her apartment into a nightclub. The noise was unbearable. It wasn't just the music anymore. It was the shouting, the constant stomping on the floor, and the sound of furniture being dragged around at all hours. I was getting no sleep, and it was starting to affect my work. One night, after another sleepless weekend, I decided enough was enough. I marched upstairs and pounded on Karen's door, determined to get her to see reason. This time, she actually answered. She was drunk, of course, and when I asked her to turn down the music, she laughed in my face. "It's my apartment," she slurred. "I can do whatever I want." Frustrated, I went back to my apartment and called the building management. They assured me they would take care of it, but nothing changed. In fact, Karen seemed to get worse after that. She began deliberately making noise during the night, dropping heavy objects, slamming doors, and even banging on the floor with what sounded like a hammer. It felt like she was trying to drive me out. The final straw came when she started harassing me directly. I would come home to find trash on my doorstep, my door handle smeared with something foul, or obscene notes slipped under my door. She even keyed my car in the parking garage, leaving deep scratches along the side. I went back to the building management, desperate for help, but they were useless. They claimed they couldn't do anything without proof, despite the fact that I had recorded some of the noise and taken pictures of the damage to my car. They suggested I move out if I wasn't happy, but I couldn't afford to break my lease. With no other options, I decided to file a police report. The police came by to talk to Karen, but she was too smart for that. She played the innocent victim, claiming that I was harassing her, and the police left without doing anything. The harassment continued, and now I was getting anonymous threats in my mailbox. I had no proof it was Karen, but I knew it was her. I was at my wit's end, barely sleeping, constantly stressed, and terrified of what she would do next. One day, I came home to find my apartment flooded. Karen had somehow tampered with the pipes, causing a leak that destroyed my furniture, electronics, and personal belongings. I was devastated. That was it for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed up what little I had left and moved out, breaking my lease and losing my deposit in the process. I never looked back. A few months later, I heard through the grapevine that Karen had been evicted after a new tenant recorded her breaking into their apartment. Apparently, she had a history of harassment and vandalism in several other buildings, but always managed to avoid getting caught. I felt a small sense of justice, but the damage was done. Living next to Karen was a true nightmare. It was a year of my life filled with stress, fear, and sleepless nights that I'll never get back. Moving out was the best decision I ever made, and I can only hope she doesn't do the same to anyone else. The Hoarder House from Hell. When the Smith family moved into the charming suburban neighborhood, they were thrilled to finally have their dream home. The only thing they hadn't anticipated was the house next door. It belonged to Mrs. Williams, an elderly woman who had lived there for decades. From the outside, her home looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The lawn was overgrown, windows were dirty, and the porch was cluttered with random objects. At first, the Smiths didn't think much of it. Mrs. Williams kept to herself, rarely leaving the house, but soon they began to notice a strange smell emanating from her property. It was a pungent odor that grew stronger with each passing day, seeping into their home and making it unbearable to sit outside. One day, a concerned neighbor called the authorities for a welfare check. What they found inside Mrs. Williams' house was horrifying. The entire place was filled floor to ceiling with junk, rotting food, newspapers, broken appliances, and worse. It was a hoarder's paradise, and the smell was coming from several dead animals that had been buried under the piles of trash. The cleanup took weeks, and during that time, the Smith family had to deal with the stench, the constant presence of workers, and the sheer shock of what had been hiding next door. Even after the house was cleaned out, the memory of what they had witnessed haunted them, and the smell seemed to linger in the neighborhood for months. The screaming couple. Living in an apartment complex can be noisy, but nothing could have prepared me for the couple that moved in next door. From the moment they arrived, it was clear that they were not going to be quiet neighbors. Almost every night, the couple would get into vicious arguments that echoed through the walls. They screamed at each other at the top of their lungs, throwing things and slamming doors. The fights were so intense that I feared for their safety, and on more than one occasion, I considered calling the police. But every time the argument would escalate, it would suddenly stop, and the next day, they would act as if nothing had happened. This cycle continued for months, and I was stuck in the middle of their toxic relationship. One night, the fighting reached a new level. I heard a crash so loud it shook my apartment, followed by a scream that chilled me to the bone. This time, I didn't hesitate. I called the police. When they arrived, they found the couple in a violent altercation that had left their apartment in shambles. Both were arrested, and the building finally had a few nights of peace. But even after they moved out, the memory of their constant battles left a mark. The walls seemed to echo with the sounds of their screaming, and it took a long time before I could relax in my own home again. The Watcher. There was something unsettling about my neighbor, Mr. Peterson, from the moment I met him. He was an older man, quiet and reserved, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. At first I tried to ignore it, but then I started noticing things. Every time I went outside, he was there, standing in his yard, watching me. It didn't matter what time of day it was. If I stepped outside, I would feel his gaze on me. It wasn't just me either. Other neighbors had mentioned that they felt like they were being watched too. Some even claimed to have seen him peering into their windows at night. The more I thought about it, the more paranoid I became. I started keeping my curtains closed, avoiding going outside unless absolutely necessary. One night, I woke up to the sound of something tapping on my window. My heart raced as I slowly pulled back the curtain, and there he was, Mr. Peterson, standing right outside my window, staring in with a blank expression on his face. I screamed, and he ran off into the darkness. The police were called, but they couldn't do much. Mr. Peterson denied everything, claiming he was just checking on a noise he heard. But after that night, I couldn't stay in the house. I moved out a few weeks later, but I still get chills thinking about his cold, unblinking eyes watching me from the shadows. The party house. When the Johnson family moved in next door, I didn't think much of it. They seemed like a normal family, 2 parents, 2 kids, a dog. But soon after they settled in, the parties began. Every weekend, without fail, they would throw massive parties that would last well into the early morning hours. The noise was unbearable. Music blaring, people shouting, cars coming and going at all hours. It wasn't just the noise that was the problem. Their guests would often spill over into our yard, leaving behind trash, empty beer bottles, and even vandalizing our property. Complaints to the Johnsons fell on deaf ears, and the police were called so many times that they started ignoring our calls. The final straw came when one of their parties got out of hand and someone set off fireworks in our backyard. The resulting fire damaged our fence and nearly spread to our house. That was it. I filed a complaint with the city, and after a lengthy legal battle, the Johnsons were finally forced to move out. The relief I felt when they were gone was indescribable. The peace and quiet that returned to the neighborhood felt like a long-lost friend. But the damage they did left a lasting impact, and it took a long time before I could fully enjoy my home again. The animal hoarder. When the new tenant, Ms. Blackwell, moved into the house across the street, everything seemed normal at first. She was friendly, kept to herself, and didn't seem to cause any trouble. But soon, we started noticing the animals. At first, it was just a couple of cats and dogs, nothing out of the ordinary. But then more and more animals started appearing. Before long, Ms. Blackwell's house was overrun with animals, cats, dogs, birds, rabbits, you name it. The smell was awful and the noise was constant. The animals were not well cared for. They were skinny, sickly, and constantly barking or mewing. Neighbors tried to talk to Ms. Blackwell, but she insisted that everything was fine. Finally, someone called animal control, and when they arrived, they were horrified by what they found. The house was filthy, filled with animal waste, and the animals were in terrible condition. Many had to be taken away for medical treatment, and the house was condemned. Ms. Blackwell was taken to a mental health facility, and the house was eventually torn down. The neighborhood was left with the memory of the stench and the sight of sick, neglected animals, and it took a long time before anyone could talk about it without shuddering. The prankster, my neighbor Tom, was known as the Neighborhood Prankster. At first, his pranks were harmless, plastic flamingos in the yard, fake parking tickets, silly stuff. But then he started targeting me, and the pranks quickly turned malicious. It started with small things, fake eviction notices on my door, my car mysteriously getting towed, strange noises in the middle of the night. But then it escalated. One morning, I woke up to find my entire yard covered in toilet paper and my car wrapped in plastic wrap. Another time, he filled my mailbox with dead fish, the smell of which lingered for days. I tried to confront Tom, but he always played it off as a joke. "Come on, it's just a prank," he would say, laughing it off. But it wasn't funny anymore. It was harassment. I tried to ignore it, but the pranks kept coming, each one more elaborate and destructive than the last. Finally, I had enough. I installed security cameras around my property and caught Tom in the act, setting up his latest prank, this time, a large pile of manure on my front porch. With the evidence in hand, I went to the police, and Tom was fined and forced to stop. The prank stopped, but the damage was done. My yard was ruined, my nerds were shut, and I couldn't look at Tom without feeling a surge of anger. Living next to him had turned into a living nightmare, and I seriously considered moving just to get away from him. The cult neighbors. The small, close-knit neighborhood where I lived was a peaceful place until the McAllister family moved in. They were strange from the start, dressing in old-fashioned clothes, rarely speaking to anyone, and keeping to themselves. But it wasn't until they started having gatherings at their house that we began to worry. Every week, people dressed in the same old-fashioned clothes would arrive at the McAllisters' house. They would chant, sing strange songs, and burn incense that filled the entire street with a sickly sweet smell. The gatherings would go on for hours, sometimes late into the night. Curiosity got the better of one of our neighbors, who decided to sneak over and see what was going on. What they saw was disturbing. People sitting in a circle, holding hands, chanting in a language no one could understand. At the center of the circle was a small altar with strange symbols and objects on it. Rumors started flying that the McAllisters were part of a cult. People started avoiding them, and some even considered moving away. The police were called several times, but without any concrete evidence of wrongdoing, they couldn't do much. The McAllisters eventually moved away as suddenly as they had arrived, leaving behind a trail of fear and confusion. To this day, no one knows what they were really up to, but the memory of their eerie gatherings still haunts the neighborhood. The crazy cat lady. Everyone in the neighborhood knew Mrs. Perkins, the crazy cat lady. She lived alone in a small house that was literally overrun with cats, dozens of them. They were everywhere, on the roof, in the yard, on the porch. The smell was unbearable, and the cats themselves were often aggressive, scratching and hissing at anyone who got too close. At first, the neighbors tried to be understanding. Mrs. Perkins was an elderly woman, after all, and clearly lonely. But when the cats started causing problems, destroying gardens, digging through trash, even attacking people, it became clear that something had to be done. Animal control was called multiple times, but Mrs. Perkins would always refuse to let them take the cats. She insisted they were her family and that she was taking good care of them. But the truth was, she was overwhelmed. The cats were breeding out of control, and many were sick or injured. One night, a fire broke out in Mrs. Perkins' house. The cause was never determined, but it spread quickly, fueled by the clutter and filth inside. The fire department managed to save most of the cats, but Mrs. Perkins didn't make it out. The house was a total loss, and the surviving cats were taken to shelters. The neighborhood was left to deal with the aftermath: burned-out property, the lingering smell of smoke, and the memory of the crazy cat lady who had lived among them. The mysterious odor. It started with a faint, unpleasant smell that no one could quite identify. It wasn't strong at first, just a hint of something rotten in the air. But over time, the smell grew stronger until it was impossible to ignore. It permeated everything: clothes, furniture, even the walls. The neighbors tried everything to find the source of the smell, cleaning their houses from top to bottom, hiring pest control, even calling the city to check the sewer lines. But nothing worked. The smell persisted, growing worse by the day. Finally, one of the neighbors, Mr. Lopez, decided to investigate the abandoned house at the end of the street. The house had been empty for years, and everyone assumed it was just another foreclosure. But when Mr. Lopez entered, he found the source of the smell: a decomposing body. The body belonged to the previous owner, who had apparently passed away years ago. No one had noticed because the house was in a secluded part of the neighborhood, and the owner had no family or friends. The smell had finally made its way outside as the body decayed, permeating the entire neighborhood. The discovery shocked everyone, and the neighborhood was left to deal with the gruesome aftermath. The house was eventually torn down, but the memory of the mysterious odor haunted everyone who had lived through it. The Nosey Neighbor. Mrs. Thompson was the nosiest neighbor I had ever encountered. From the moment I moved in, she made it her mission to know everything about me. She would peek over the fence, watch through her windows, and even follow me when I left the house. It was like having my own personal stalker. At first, I tried to be polite. I would wave and say hello, but it quickly became clear that Mrs. Thompson was not interested in friendly conversation. She wanted information. She would ask invasive questions about my job, my personal life, even my finances. When I didn't answer, she would make up her own stories and spread them around the neighborhood. It wasn't just me either. Mrs. Thompson had dirt on everyone. She knew who was behind on their mortgage, who was cheating on their spouse, and who had a secret drinking problem. She would use this information to manipulate and control people, threatening to expose their secrets if they didn't do what she wanted. One day, I came home to find Mrs. Thompson in my backyard, snooping around my garden. When I confronted her, she claimed she was just admiring the flowers, but I knew better. I had had enough. I told her to stay off my property and keep her nose out of my business. From that day on, Mrs. Thompson made it her mission to make my life miserable. She would report me to the city for every little thing. My grass was too long, my car was parked too close to the curb, my trash cans weren't out on time. It was constant harassment, and I felt like I was living under a microscope. Finally, I decided to move. It wasn't worth the stress of living next to Mrs. Thompson. As I was packing up, I heard a knock on the door. It was one of the other neighbors who had also had enough of Mrs. Thompson's antics. They told me that the entire neighborhood was planning to file a restraining order against her. I wished them luck and drove away, relieved to finally be free of the nosy neighbor from hell. The backyard battleground. When the Millers moved in next door, I was hopeful that we'd get along. They seemed friendly enough at first, even inviting me over for a barbecue shortly after they settled in. But it didn't take long for things to take a turn for the worse. It all started with a simple fence, one that separated my backyard from theirs. The Millers decided they didn't like the existing fence and wanted to replace it with something taller and more private. They approached me about splitting the cost, but I wasn't interested. My fence was perfectly fine, and I saw no reason to change it. That's when the trouble began. Without my consent, the Millers tore down the fence and started building a new one, encroaching several feet into my property. I confronted them, but they brushed me off, claiming it was their right to do whatever they wanted. I was furious and contacted a surveyor to confirm the property lines. Sure enough, they were in the wrong. When I presented them with the evidence, they became hostile, accusing me of being a bad neighbor and trying to make their lives difficult. The situation escalated into a full-blown feud. They began harassing me, blasting loud music late at night, throwing trash over the fence, and even threatening to sue me if I didn't back off. The final straw came when I found that they had installed security cameras pointed directly into my backyard. It felt like an invasion of privacy, and I had had enough. I filed a lawsuit against them for trespassing and harassment, and after a long, drawn-out legal battle, the court ruled in my favor. The Millers were forced to remove the fence and pay for the damages, but the animosity between us never faded. Living next to them became unbearable, and eventually, I decided to sell my house and move away. The whole experience left me wary of ever trusting a neighbor again. The creepy collector. Mr. Norton was known in the neighborhood as an odd but harmless man. He kept to himself, rarely interacted with anyone, and spent most of his time in his garage. The rumors about what he did in there were endless. Some said he was a tinkerer, others claimed he was a hoarder, but no one knew for sure. One day, I was walking past his house when I noticed something unusual. The garage door was slightly open, and I could see inside. It was filled with the strangest collection I had ever seen, dolls. Hundreds of them, all in various states of disrepair. Some were missing limbs, others had cracked faces, but they were all arranged meticulously on shelves that lined the walls. Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked Mr. Norton about his collection the next time I saw him. He seemed delighted that someone had taken an interest and invited me inside to see the rest. What I saw sent shivers down my spine. His entire house was filled with dolls, every room, every surface. Some were antique, others looked homemade, but they all had one thing in common. They were unsettling. Mr. Norton explained that he had been collecting dolls for years, ever since his wife had passed away. He claimed they kept him company and made him feel less alone. but there was something about the way he spoke about them that made me uneasy, almost as if he believed the dolls were alive. After that day, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread whenever I walked past his house. The dolls seemed to watch me from the windows, their lifeless eyes following me as I passed by. I started avoiding that part of the street altogether, and I wasn't the only one. Other neighbors began to notice strange occurrences, dolls appearing in their yards, creepy noises coming from Mr. Norton's house late at night. One evening, the police were called to Mr. Norton's house after a neighbor reported hearing screams. When they arrived, they'd found Mr. Norton in his garage, surrounded by his dolls. He was in a state of panic, claiming that the dolls had come to life and were trying to kill him. The police dismissed it as a delusion, but after that night, Mr. Norton was never the same. He became even more reclusive, rarely leaving his house, and the rumors about him only grew. Eventually, he moved away, leaving his creepy collection behind. The house remained vacant for years, with no one willing to buy it. The dolls were removed, but their memory lingered in the neighborhood, a reminder of the strange and unsettling man who had once lived among us. The Yard Vigilant. Living in a suburban neighborhood means dealing with the occasional nosy neighbor, but Mr. Jenkins took it to a whole new level. He was obsessed with maintaining the perfect yard and expected everyone else to do the same. If your grass was too long, he would leave passive-aggressive notes in your mailbox. If your flowers weren't blooming to his standards, he would knock on your door to offer unsolicited advice. At first, it was just annoying, but then Mr. Jenkins started taking matters into his own hands. He would sneak into people's yards in the middle of the night, pulling weeds, trimming bushes, and even mowing lawns without permission. While some neighbors appreciated the help, most were furious that he was trespassing on their property. The situation escalated when Mr. Jenkins decided to improve my garden. I woke up one morning to find that he had dug up several of my plants and replaced them with flowers that he deemed more suitable. I confronted him, but he insisted that he was just trying to help and that I should be grateful. I wasn't the only one affected. Mr. Jenkins had become the self-appointed Yard Vigilant of the neighborhood, and no one's property was safe. The final straw came when he decided to cut down a tree in another neighbor's yard, claiming it was diseased and a danger to the community. The neighbor was livid and called the police, but Mr. Jenkins simply shrugged it off, saying he was doing everyone a favor. The neighborhood finally banded together and filed a restraining order against Mr. Jenkins. He was forced to stay off other people's property, but the damage was done. His actions had caused tension and distrust among neighbors, and the once friendly community was now divided. Mr. Jenkins eventually moved away, but his reputation as the Yard Vigilant lived on. No one missed his unwelcome help, and the neighborhood slowly returned to normal, though it took a long time for everyone to feel comfortable in their own yards again. The constant complainer. Living in a quiet neighborhood can be peaceful, but not when you have a neighbor like Mrs. O'Brien. From the moment she moved in, she had something to complain about. The noise from the kids playing outside, the way people park their cars, the smell of someone's barbecue, nothing escaped her scrutiny. At first, we all tried to be accommodating, thinking she was just adjusting to the new environment. But no matter what we did, it was never enough. She would call the police for the smallest infractions, someone's dog barking, a lawnmower running too early in the morning, even the sound of wind chimes. It was relentless. Mrs. O'Brien didn't stop at just complaining to the authorities. She took it upon herself to personally confront anyone she felt was disturbing her peace. She would march over to their house, knock on the door, and launch into a tirade about whatever perceived offense they had committed. It didn't matter if it was a weekday afternoon or a weekend morning, she was always ready to complain. The situation became unbearable when she started filing false complaints with the Homeowners Association. She claimed that people were violating neighborhood rules that didn't even exist, and she would harass anyone who didn't immediately comply with her demands. The HOA was flooded with complaints, and eventually they had to intervene. A special meeting was called, and the entire neighborhood turned out to address the issue. Mrs. O'Brien was confronted with her behavior, and while she tried to defend herself, it was clear that she was the problem. The HOA issued her a formal warning, and she was put on probation with the threat of fines if she continued her harassment. After that, Mrs. O'Brien became even more reclusive, rarely leaving her house except to glare at anyone who passed by. The neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief, but the tension remained. Living next to her had turned what should have been a peaceful existence into a constant battle, and it took a long time for the community to heal. The dumpster diver. Living in an apartment complex means sharing common spaces with your neighbors, but one neighbor took things too far. Mr. Lawson, a middle-aged man who lived on the first floor, had an unusual hobby, dumpster diving. At first it seemed harmless enough. He would rummage through the complex dumpsters, pulling out anything he thought was valuable, old furniture, broken appliances, even bags of clothes. But as time went on, Mr. Lawson's behavior became more intrusive. He started going through everyone's trash, dragging bags out of the bins and scattering them across the parking lot as he searched for treasures. The mess he left behind was disgusting. Rotting food, dirty diapers, and all manner of filth would be strewn everywhere. Complaints to the management fell on deaf ears, as Mr. Lawson insisted he had every right to go through the trash since it was technically abandoned property. The situation became unbearable when he started bringing his finds into his apartment. The stench from his hoarded trash filled the hallways, and the cockroach infestation that followed was the final straw. The complex finally took action after several tenants threatened to break their leases. Mr. Lawson was evicted, but not before his apartment had to be completely fumigated and renovated due to the damage caused by his dumpster diving. The complex returned to normal, but the memory of the smell and the filth lingered long after he was gone. The perpetual renovator. When the Sandersons moved in next door, I was excited to have new neighbors. They seemed friendly enough and mentioned that they were planning to do some renovations on the house. I thought it would be a quick project, and soon we'd all enjoy the results. But I couldn't have been more wrong. The renovations started almost immediately, and they never stopped. For months, there was constant noise, hammering, drilling, sawing, at all hours of the day and night. The construction vehicles took up all the parking on the street, and there was a never-ending stream of contractors coming and going. Every time I thought the renovations were finally done, the Sandersons would start a new project. They tore down walls, added extensions, built new fences, and even installed a pool. The noise was unbearable, and the dust and debris from the construction coated everything. I tried talking to them, asking if they could at least keep the noise to a reasonable time, but they were unapologetic. "We're just trying to make our house perfect," they would say. But their quest for perfection turned into a never-ending nightmare for everyone else in the neighborhood. The situation dragged on for nearly 2 years, with no end in sight. The once quiet neighborhood was now a constant construction zone, and the stress of living next to it was overwhelming. I seriously considered moving just to get away from the noise and chaos, but before I could, the Sandersons finally finished their renovations. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, but it took a long time to recover from the disruption. The Pet Hoarder. When Mrs. Green moved in with her 2 dogs, it seemed like she was just another animal lover. But it didn't take long for things to spiral out of control. Within a few months, the 2 dogs became 4, then 6, then 10. Soon, Mrs. Green's house was overflowing with animals, dogs, cats, birds, even a few rabbits. The noise was constant, barking, howling, squawking, and the smell was unbearable. The animals were not well cared for, and many of them looked sick and malnourished. But when neighbors tried to intervene, Mrs. Green became defensive, insisting that she was giving the animals a good home. The situation got worse when the animals started escaping from her yard. They would roam the neighborhood, getting into garbage cans, digging up gardens, and even attacking other pets. Animal control was called multiple times, but Mrs. Green always managed to get the animals back, and the cycle would start all over again. The neighborhood reached its breaking point when a pack of Mrs. Green's dogs attacked a child who was playing in their yard. The child was not seriously injured, but it was the final straw. The authorities stepped in, and Mrs. Green was forced to give up most of her animals. The house was condemned due to the unsanitary conditions, and Mrs. Green moved away. The neighborhood was left to deal with the aftermath, damaged property, traumatized pets, and a lingering memory of the constant noise and smell. It took a long time to fully recover, and no one ever forgot the pet hoarder who had turned their peaceful street into a nightmare. The serial renovator. When Mr. and Mrs. Clark moved into the old Victorian house across the street, everyone was thrilled. The house had been vacant for years and was in desperate need of repair. The Clarks seemed like the perfect couple to bring it back to life. But as it turned out, their idea of renovation was a never-ending project. The construction started almost immediately. Dumpsters were brought in, contractors were on site daily, and the sound of power tools became a constant background noise. At first, the neighborhood was understanding. After all, the house was in rough shape. But as weeks turned into months and then into years, the renovations never seemed to stop. Every few months, the Clarks would announce a new phase of their project, restoring the original woodwork, adding a new wing, renovating the basement. Each phase brought with it more noise, more mess, and more disruption. The street was constantly blocked by construction vehicles, and the dust from the work covered everything. It wasn't just the noise and mess that were the problem. The Clarks became increasingly isolated, rarely speaking to anyone and refusing to attend neighborhood meetings. They were so focused on their endless renovations that they didn't seem to care about the impact it was having on everyone else. The final straw came when they decided to install a new roof in the middle of winter. The construction workers were on site from dawn until well after dark, making noise and creating a dangerous situation with ice and debris. The neighborhood finally banded together and filed a complaint with the city, forcing the Clarks to halt their renovations until the weather improved. The house is still not finished, and the Clarks have become the talk of the neighborhood. What was once a project everyone was excited about has turned into a nightmare that seems to have no end. The party animals. When the frat boys moved into the house down the street, the entire neighborhood braced for impact. It was clear from day one that these guys were not going to be quiet, respectful neighbors. The first party they threw was legendary. Dozens of people spilling out into the yard, music blasting so loud it shook the windows, and the smell of beer and barbecue filling the air. The parties became a regular occurrence, happening every weekend and sometimes even during the week. The noise was unbearable, but it was the aftermath that was even worse. The street was littered with trash, empty cans, broken bottles, cigarette butts, and the smell of stale beer hung in the air long after the party was over. The frat boys showed no signs of slowing down, even after multiple complaints to the police and the landlord. They would just shrug off the warnings and keep the party going. It wasn't just the noise and the mess, it was the constant stream of strangers coming and going at all hours, the loud arguments that would break out in the middle of the night, and the general sense of chaos that surrounded the house. One night, things took a dangerous turn. A fight broke out during one of the parties and someone pulled a knife. The police were called, and the party was finally shut down. But even that wasn't enough to stop the frat boys. They were back at it the next weekend, as if nothing had happened. The neighborhood eventually banded together and hired a lawyer to get the frat boys evicted. It took months, but they were finally forced to leave. The house sat vacant for a while, a reminder of the chaos that had once ruled the street. The peace and quiet that returned was a relief, but the damage had been done, and it took a long time for the neighborhood to fully recover. The surveillance freak. Mr. and Mrs. Dawkins seemed like an ordinary retired couple when they first moved in, but it didn't take long for their true nature to reveal itself. They were obsessed with security, and their house soon became a fortress, with cameras on every corner, motion sensors, and floodlights that would blind you if you walked past at night. At first, the neighbors were understanding. Everyone wants to feel safe in their own home. But the Dawkins took it too far. The cameras weren't just pointed at their own property, they were aimed at everyone else's too. They monitored every move their neighbors made, recording who came and went, what time they left for work, and even what they were wearing. It felt like living under constant surveillance, and it wasn't long before the neighborhood started to feel paranoid. People stopped going outside as much, worried about being watched. Conversations were whispered, and no one felt comfortable in their own yards anymore. The Dawkins insisted that they were just protecting themselves, but it was clear that they were spying on everyone. The final straw came when they installed a loudspeaker system and started shouting at people to stay off their property, even if they were just walking on the sidewalk. The neighborhood finally banded together and filed a complaint with the city, citing privacy violations and harassment. The Dawkins were ordered to reposition their cameras and take down the loudspeakers, but the damage was done. The sense of community that had once existed was shattered, replaced by a lingering unease that took a long time to dissipate. The fireworks fanatics. The Johnson family loved fireworks, so much so that they would set them off at every opportunity. It didn't matter if it was the 4th of July or just a random Tuesday night. If the Johnsons felt like celebrating, the neighborhood was treated to a private fireworks show. At first, it was just annoying. The loud bangs and flashes of light would scare pets, wake up sleeping babies, and generally disturb the peace. But the Johnsons didn't seem to care. In fact, they seemed to relish the attention, setting off even more fireworks whenever someone complained. The situation escalated when they started setting off larger and more dangerous fireworks. The explosions shook the windows and left scorch marks on the street. The debris from the fireworks would rain down on everyone's yards, leaving a mess that no one wanted to clean up. The neighborhood was fed up, but every time the police were called, the Johnsons would claim they were just celebrating a holiday or special occasion. It was always just within the bounds of legality, but it was clear that they were pushing the limits. The final straw came when a firework went astray and hit a neighbor's roof, starting a small fire. The fire department managed to put it out before it caused serious damage, but it was the wake-up call the neighborhood needed. The Johnsons were reported to the fire marshal, and they were finally forced to stop their constant fireworks displays. The neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief, but the sound of fireworks still brought back memories of the sleepless nights and constant fear that something would go horribly wrong. The constant gardener. When Mr. and Mrs. Stevens moved in, they made it clear that they were passionate about gardening. At first, their beautifully manicured lawn and vibrant flower beds were a welcome addition to the neighborhood. But it didn't take long for their obsession to become a problem. The Stevens spent every waking moment in their garden, and they expected everyone else to do the same. They would knock on doors, offering unsolicited advice on how to care for your lawn, what plants to grow, and even how to arrange your flower beds. If you didn't follow their advice, they would leave passive-aggressive notes or make snide comments whenever they saw you. But their obsession didn't stop at advice. The Stevens began sneaking into other people's yards at night, pulling weeds, trimming bushes, and even planting flowers. While some neighbors appreciated the help, most were furious that their property was being tampered with without their consent. The final straw came when the Stevens decided that the neighborhood park needed a makeover. They spent days digging up the grass, planting flowers, and rearranging the landscaping without any permission from the city or the homeowners association. The result was a chaotic mess that no one wanted. The neighborhood banded together and filed a complaint with the city, forcing the Stevens to stop their unauthorized gardening. The park had to be restored to its original state, and the Stevens were warned to stay out of other people's yards. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal, but the memory of their relentless gardening obsession lingered. The mysterious smell. It started with a faint, unpleasant odor that no one could quite identify. It wasn't strong at first, just a hint of something rotten in the air. But over time, the smell grew stronger until it was impossible to ignore. It permeated everything: clothes, furniture, even the walls. The neighbors tried everything to find the source of the smell, cleaning their houses from top to bottom, hiring pest control, even calling the city to check the sewer lines. But nothing worked. The smell persisted, growing worse by the day. Finally, one of the neighbors, Mr. Lopez, decided to investigate the abandoned house at the end of the street. The house had been empty for years, and everyone assumed it was just another foreclosure. But when Mr. Lopez entered, he found the source of the smell: a decomposing body. The body belonged to the previous owner, who had apparently passed away years ago. No one had noticed because the house was in a secluded part of the neighborhood, and the owner had no family or friends. The smell had finally made its way outside as the body decayed, permeating the entire neighborhood. The discovery shocked everyone, and the neighborhood was left to deal with the gruesome aftermath. The house was eventually torn down, but the memory of the mysterious odor haunted everyone who had lived through it. The loud lovers. Living in an apartment building means dealing with noise, but nothing could have prepared me for the couple that moved in above me. They were loud, very loud, and not just during the day. Every night, like clockwork, the sounds would start: moaning, shouting, even furniture banging against the walls. It was impossible to ignore, and it went on for hours. I tried everything to drown out the noise: earplugs, white noise machines, even sleeping in the living room, but nothing worked. I wasn't the only one suffering. Other neighbors complained as well, but the couple seemed oblivious to the disturbance they were causing. One night, after yet another sleepless evening, I decided to confront them. I knocked on their door, and when they answered, I could barely contain my frustration. I asked them politely to keep the noise down, but they just laughed it off, saying, "We're in love. What do you expect?" The situation continued for months, with no end in sight. The constant noise was driving me crazy, and it was starting to affect my work and personal life. I complained to the building management, but they said there was little they could do unless the noise was happening during quiet hours, which it often was. Finally, I had enough. I recorded the noise and took it to the management, demanding that something be done. After hearing the recording, they agreed to speak to the couple. The noise finally stopped, but the damage was done. I had lost countless nights of sleep, and the stress of living below such inconsiderate neighbors had taken its toll. It was a relief when they'd finally moved out, and I could finally get some peace and quiet. The parking nightmare. The neighborhood was usually peaceful, but everything changed when the Harris family moved in. They had several cars, more than their driveway could accommodate, so they started parking on the street. At first, it wasn't a big deal, but then they began parking in front of other people's homes, blocking driveways, and even taking up spots reserved for visitors. The situation escalated when they began parking their cars on the grass, damaging the carefully maintained lawns. They would leave their cars there for days, sometimes even weeks, without moving them. Neighbors who tried to talk to them were met with hostility, and the Harris family seemed to take pleasure in causing inconvenience. The final straw came when they parked a large, rusted-out RV right in front of my house. It was an eyesore, and they used it to store junk, which only added to the mess. The RV blocked the view from my window, and the smell from the garbage inside was unbearable. Complaints to the city were slow to result in action, and the situation dragged on for months. It wasn't until the entire neighborhood banded together and demanded action that the city finally intervened. The Harris family was forced to move the RV and limit the number of cars they could park on the street. The neighborhood returned to its usual calm, but the memory of the parking nightmare left everyone on edge, always wary of the next potential parking problem. The abandoned house. When the Mitchell family suddenly left town, they didn't bother to sell their house or even rent it out. Instead, they left it abandoned, and the once beautiful home quickly fell into disrepair. The yard became overgrown, the paint began to peel, and windows were left broken after storms. The abandoned house became a magnet for trouble. Teenagers would break into party, leaving behind trash and graffiti. Stray animals began to take shelter in the yard, and it wasn't long before the house was infested with rats. The neighborhood tried to maintain the property by mowing the lawn and boarding up windows, but it was a losing battle. The situation became even more dire when the house was set on fire one night. Luckily, the fire department arrived in time to put out the blaze, but the house was left severely damaged. It sat as a charred, abandoned husk, a constant reminder of the danger it posed. The neighborhood petitioned the city to do something about the house, but the process was slow. It took years before the city finally condemned the property and had it demolished. By then, the damage had been done, property values had dropped, and the once beautiful neighborhood had been scarred by the presence of the abandoned house. The nosy neighbor. Mrs. Jensen was the kind of neighbor who always had to know what was going on. From the moment I moved in, she made it clear that she was watching everything. She would peek through her blinds whenever I came or went, and if I had visitors, she would interrogate them as soon as they stepped out of the car. At first, I tried to be polite, but her constant snooping was driving me crazy. She would ask intrusive questions about my personal life, and if I didn't answer, she would make up her own stories and spread them around the neighborhood. It wasn't long before I realized that everyone was wary of her. The situation escalated when she started going through my mail. I would find letters and packages opened and left on my porch. When I confronted her, she denied everything, but it was clear that she was the culprit. I reported her to the Postal Service, but they said there wasn't much they could do without solid proof. Things got even worse when Mrs. Jensen installed security cameras that pointed directly at my front door and driveway. It felt like living under constant surveillance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was always watching. The breaking point came when she reported me to the city for having an unlicensed pet, which wasn't true. I decided to move out, not wanting to deal with her any longer. The relief I felt when I left that neighborhood was immense, but the memory of Mrs. Jensen's nosiness still haunts me. The the constant critic. Mr. Thompson was the neighborhood's self-appointed critic. He had an opinion on everything, and he wasn't shy about sharing it. From the color of your house to the type of car you drove, nothing was off limits. He would stop you on the street to give unsolicited advice or criticize something he didn't like. At first, it was annoying but manageable. However, as time went on, Mr. Thompson's critiques became more aggressive. He would leave nasty notes on people's doors, pointing out what he thought were flaws in their homes or yards. If you didn't mow your lawn to his standards, you'd find a note about it the next day. The situation escalated when he started reporting people to the Homeowners Association for minor infractions. Things like having a garden gnome he deemed tacky or planting flowers that didn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. He made life miserable for everyone, and no one could escape his constant criticism. The final straw came when he reported a neighbor for having their Christmas lights up too long after the holidays. The Homeowners Association finally had enough and issued him a formal warning, telling him to stop his harassment or face fines. Mr. Thompson's behavior didn't stop completely, but it did lessen. The neighborhood slowly recovered from his constant criticism, but the tension remained. People were always on edge, wondering what he would complain about next. The backyard breeder. The new neighbors, the Whites, seemed nice enough at first. They had a couple of dogs, which was no big deal. Plenty of people in the neighborhood had pets. But it soon became clear that the Whites weren't just pet owners, they were running a backyard breeding operation. Within weeks, the number of dogs in their yard multiplied. The barking was constant, day and night, and the smell was overwhelming. The dogs were kept in small, filthy pens, and it was clear that they weren't being properly cared for. The noise and stench were unbearable, and the sight of so many dogs crammed into such a small space was heartbreaking. Neighbors tried to talk to the Whites, but they were dismissive, claiming that the dogs were well cared for and that they had every right to breed them. The situation continued for months, with the noise, smell, and the sight of neglected animals becoming increasingly intolerable. Finally, someone called animal control. When they arrived, they found that the conditions were far worse than anyone had imagined. The dogs were malnourished, sick, and many were in desperate need of medical attention. The Whites were fined and forced to shut down their operation, and the dogs were taken to shelters. The neighborhood was relieved when the breeding stopped, but the damage had been done. The constant noise, the smell, and the sight of those poor dogs had taken a toll on everyone. It took a long time for the neighborhood to recover from the Whites' backyard breeding nightmare. The Midnight Dyer. Mr. Garcia loved working on home improvement projects, which wouldn't have been a problem if he hadn't chosen to do them in the middle of the night. Every night, like clockwork, the sound of power tools would start up, saws, drills, hammers. It was as if he had no concept of time or consideration for his neighbors. The noise was relentless, keeping the entire neighborhood awake. People tried to talk to Mr. Garcia, asking him to keep the noise down or at least work during the day, but he was unapologetic. "It's the only time I have," he would say, as if that excused the constant disruption. The situation dragged on for months, with no sign of improvement. The noise complaints to the police resulted in temporary quiet, but Mr. Garcia would always start up again the next night. The sleep deprivation was affecting everyone, and the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The final straw came when Mr. Garcia decided to build a deck late one night. The hammering and sawing were louder than ever, and no one could sleep through it. The police were called once again, and this time the neighborhood banded together to file a formal noise complaint with the city. Mr. Garcia was finally forced to cease his midnight projects, but the damage had been done. The neighborhood had lost countless nights of sleep, and the resentment toward him lingered long after the noise stopped. The overzealous gardener. When Mrs. Edwards moved in, she quickly gained a reputation as the neighborhood's green thumb. Her garden was beautiful, filled with colorful flowers and perfectly manicured shrubs, but it didn't take long for her passion for gardening to become an obsession. Mrs. Edwards was constantly in her garden, which wouldn't have been a problem if she had kept to her own yard. But she began expanding her efforts into other people's property, planting flowers and trimming bushes without permission. She claimed she was just trying to beautify the neighborhood, but most people were furious that she was messing with their property. The situation escalated when Mrs. Edwards started planting invasive species that quickly spread into other yards, choking out native plants and causing damage to carefully maintained gardens. When confronted, she was unapologetic, insisting that she knew what was best for everyone's yard. The final straw came when she dug up a neighbor's prized rose bushes to replace them with her own plants. The neighbor was livid, and the homeowners association had to step in to mediate the dispute. The pyromaniac neighbor. When the Thompsons moved into the old farmhouse at the end of the street, no one thought much of it. They were a quiet couple, and aside from the occasional wave, they kept to themselves. But soon after they arrived, strange things began happening in the neighborhood. Small fires would break out in random places, usually in the woods or in someone's trash can. At first, people thought it was just kids playing with matches, but the fires became more frequent and more dangerous. One night, a shed caught fire, destroying all of its contents. Another night, a brush fire spread dangerously close to several homes before the fire department could put it out. It was clear that these fires weren't accidents. The neighborhood became a place of fear, with everyone wondering who could be behind the arson. Suspicion fell on the Thompsons when one of the neighbors spotted Mr. Thompson walking away from the scene of a small fire, casually smoking a cigarette. The authorities were called, but without solid evidence, there wasn't much they could do. The tension reached its peak when a car was set on fire in someone's driveway. The flames lit up the night sky, and the smell of burning rubber and metal filled the air. The fire department managed to contain it before it spread to the house, but the damage was extensive. The neighborhood banded together, installing security cameras and staying vigilant. Eventually, the Thompsons moved away, but the sense of relief was overshadowed by the fear that the arsonist might return. It took a long time for the neighborhood to feel safe again. The party bus. The Gonzalez family was known for their love of parties. Every weekend, they would host massive gatherings with loud music, endless streams of guests, and plenty of alcohol. But the situation took a turn for the worse when they bought a party bus. The bus, painted in bright neon colors and equipped with booming speakers, would roll through the neighborhood at all hours of the night. It was like a mobile nightclub, complete with flashing lights and people hanging out of the windows, shouting and laughing. The noise was deafening, and the sight of the bus cruising the streets at 2 a.m. was surreal. Neighbors who complained were met with hostility. The Gonzalez family didn't see anything wrong with their late-night joyrides, insisting that they were just having fun. But the noise, the litter, and the traffic were unbearable. The situation escalated when the party bus started parking in front of people's houses, blasting music until the early hours of the morning. The police were called multiple times, but the Gonzalezes always seemed to avoid any serious consequences. The neighborhood was at its wits' end, with everyone dreading the weekend when the party bus would make its rounds. Finally, after one particularly wild night, the police issued the Gonzalezes a hefty fine and threatened to impound the bus if they didn't stop the disturbances. The bus was sold shortly afterward, and the parties quieted down, but the neighborhood had been left scared by the months of sleepless nights and chaos. The constant feuders. The Johnsons and the Carters had been neighbors for years, but they had never gotten along. Their feud was legendary, and it seemed like they were always at each other's throats over something: fence lines, noise complaints, parking disputes, you name it. At first it was just annoying, but over time, their feud escalated to the point where it affected the entire neighborhood. They would blast loud music at each other's homes, vandalize each other's property, and even get into physical altercations. The police were a constant presence on the street, trying to keep the peace. The neighborhood was caught in the middle of their constant battles, with everyone forced to take sides or risk becoming a target themselves. It was like living in a war zone, with tension so thick you could cut it with a knife. The final straw came when the Carters put up a massive, unsightly fence along the property line to block out the Johnsons. The fence was so tall it blocked the sunlight from the Johnsons' yard, and it quickly became a source of contention for the entire neighborhood. The homeowners association had to step in and force the Carters to take it down, but the damage had been done. The feud eventually simmered down, but the neighborhood was left divided and weary from years of conflict. It took a long time for everyone to move past the animosity and return to a sense of normalcy. The loud music lover. Living next to Mr. Daniels was like living next to a concert venue. He loved music, especially loud music, and he played it constantly. From early in the morning until late at night, the walls would shake with the sound of bass and drums. It didn't matter what time it was. If Mr. Daniels felt like listening to music, he would crank up the volume. At first, the neighbors tried to be understanding. Maybe he just didn't realize how loud it was. But when multiple people tried to talk to him about it, Mr. Daniels just shrugged them off. "I'm in my own house," he would say. "I can do what I want." The noise was relentless, making it impossible to relax or even sleep. People started avoiding their own homes, spending more time out just to get away from the constant noise. Complaints to the police resulted in temporary quiet, but Mr. Daniels would always start up again the next day. The situation reached a boiling point when Mr. Daniels decided to host a party that lasted all weekend. The music blared non-stop, and the neighborhood felt like it was under siege. The police were called multiple times, but Mr. Daniels refused to turn it down, and there wasn't much they could do. Finally, the neighborhood banded together and filed a formal noise complaint with the city. Mr. Daniels was fined and forced to limit his music to certain hours, but the damage had been done. The neighborhood had lost countless nights of peace, and the resentment toward him lingered long after the music stopped. The yard sales gone wild. Mrs. Turner loved hosting yard sales. Every weekend, she would set up tables in her yard, filled with all sorts of items: clothes, furniture, knickknacks, you name it. At first, it seemed harmless, even charming. But as time went on, the yard sales became a major problem. The sales grew larger and larger, taking up not just her yard, but the sidewalk and part of the street as well. Traffic on the street became a nightmare, with cars double parked and people wandering around aimlessly. The noise from haggling and the constant flow of people was relentless, and the mess left behind was unbelievable. Neighbors who tried to talk to Mrs. Turner about the disruption were met with defensiveness. "I'm just trying to make some extra money," she would say. "What's the big deal?" But the big deal was that her yard sales were causing chaos in the neighborhood. The situation escalated when Mrs. Turner started advertising her sales online, drawing even more people from outside the neighborhood. The street would be packed with cars, and the noise would last from early morning until late in the afternoon. The neighborhood finally had enough and contacted the city, citing zoning violations and the disruption to traffic. Mrs. Turner was forced to limit her sales to once a month and keep them confined to her yard. The neighborhood finally returned to normal, but the memories of the chaotic yard sales lingered, leaving everyone wary of the next potential disruption.